Today is December 24, 2016, and we are entering into Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, and we'll be reading from Josephus' account of the story of the Maccabees. So before we get into this, let's ask our Heavenly Family for guidance. Eloheinu, Heavenly Family, Todah Lakal, Watodah Lachag Hanukkah. Thank you for everything, and thank you for the Feast of Dedication. Please guide us as we study the writings of Josephus during this feast. Help us to understand the history of your people and to learn the lessons that we can from these past experiences. And guide us to grasp the principles of truth and to apply them to our lives today, and to see the implications of what we learn in regard to all other aspects. Thank you so much. Please bless us, bind us all together in your love. Todah. We ask this B'Shem Semach, Hu He, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so just a little bit of an introduction to Hanukkah and the writings of Josephus and so on. I'm assuming that for most people here, this will not be new, but I think it's good to refresh our memories anyway, and also for any who may be on or who may listen to this later who has not been a part of our previous Hanukkah celebrations or discussions in regards to the Maccabees or anything like that. I think this will be helpful for them as well. So this feast called Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, again, the word Hanukkah, it's a Hebrew word that means dedication, and it has to do with the dedication of the temple in the 2nd century B.C. And what had taken place at the time is that Greek forces controlled by Antiochus Epiphanes had taken control over the temple on the 25th day of the 9th month in, I'm trying to remember the year, was it 167? Somewhere around there, BC. And 3 years later, on the same day, the 25th day of the 9th month, the temple was restored, the altar had sacrifices again that were performed on it, and thus the temple services were restored. That was a very important event in the history of the Jewish people. The Jews who led out in the regaining of the temple from the Greeks were known as the Maccabees, primarily because of the dominant leader whose name was Judah Maccabee, or Judah the Hammer. And eventually those whom he led were just simply known as the Maccabees, and it was known as the Maccabean Revolt, though originally the name Maccabee was just his nickname, as it were. And so Judas Maccabeus, or Judah Maccabee, that's the name of the ruler, although really he's not the one who started this revolt. It was actually his father, named Mattathias. And after him, his brothers, Jason and then Simon, also continued on this revolt. And if it was not for the Maccabean revolt, there would really be no Jewish people and land of Judah or Judea in the time of Jesus. And so it was a very significant part of the history of the Jewish people. And since the dedication of the temple under the Maccabees, there has been an 8-day celebration each year, starting on the 25th day of the 9th Hebrew month. And that celebration has been called Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication. And John chapter 10 records that Jesus went to the temple for this feast. So this isn't a particularly rabbinic thing or anything like that. It's not a later Jewish tradition. It's something that had its origin in the 2nd century BCE, and which Jesus himself observed in his own lifetime, as did the vast majority of Jews. And later Jewish tradition has a story of the miracle of the lights of the candlestick, or the menorah, and in which it was kept burning for 8 days or something along those lines. And that's not a story that is found in the books of the Maccabees that actually record this history. That is a later Jewish tradition. The focus is not actually on the menorah or on a candlestick. The focus is actually on the altar of the sanctuary and the temple itself, but most specifically the altar. And so we've had past studies on this. Last year, we actually read through some of Josephus's writings, and I'll comment on that a little bit more. But the year before, we actually focused on Maccabean typology. And Teresa posted in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook group the first of those 3 studies, and we recommend for everyone to go through that. Likewise, we posted in the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page the first study from last year's Hanukkah. And each day throughout this year's Hanukkah, we will be posting the studies from last year's Hanukkah. And so that will be going through the parts of Josephus's telling of not actually the Hanukkah event, but the preceding history. So you guys can all look forward to that, and just keep your eyes out each day on the Seven Angels Messages YouTube channel and or on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page. So Josephus, last year we went through his writings on this, and this year we will be doing the same. So anyway, Josephus, who was Josephus? Josephus was a Jewish general, and he participated in the Jewish revolt from 66 to 73, and how the revolt ended in the Battle of Masada in 73 of the Common Era. Josephus, however, he actually surrendered. His forces were up in Galilee, and he surrendered to the Romans early on, and he actually became a translator between the Roman forces and the Jewish forces, and he was a witness to the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in the year 70. And he ended up actually being adopted into the family of Rome, the royal family, as it were, the imperial family. And he ended up moving to Rome and having the rest of his life to write the history of the Jewish people and some other writings. He wrote an autobiography. He wrote a series of books called Jewish Wars, and he wrote a 20-volume series called The Antiquities of the Jews. And that's what we were reading last year, and that's what we will be reading again this year. Josephus, I think in understanding some of the things that we just said about him, it becomes apparent that his writings are a very valuable source of information. The time in which he lived, his education, his unique circumstances make him a totally unique source of information. Also, when the Romans destroyed the temple, they didn't just destroy everything. They actually took certain things with them. And part of it included temple records, which Josephus had available to him. So he had very good historical resources, and he was able to use these resources to construct the history which he told in his writings. And, it has become a Protestant tradition that there were 400 years of silence between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament. Well, such an idea is just that. It's just simply a Protestant idea. There was really no silence during that time. In fact, that period, the 400 years before Jesus, were actually very active in Judaism, and probably the majority of Jewish writings pre-Jesus came from within that 400-year period. There was a lot written during that time. There was a lot happening. And it's simply because of the structure of the Protestant canon that became such a common idea, that there are these years of silence. So when one reads the writings of Josephus, it's apparent that in his mind there wasn't, the history of the Jewish people up until the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, and then 400 years of nothing, and then his own day. No. He describes the history as one continuous flow of events from the beginning all the way up until his time. And what we did last year is we found the point in Josephus's writings, particularly in the Antiquities of the Jews, where the last events described in Ezra and Nehemiah end, and these other events, which we don't have described in the Protestant canon, are described in the writings of Josephus. And so that point is Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 7. That chapter describes some of the things at the end of the history described in books like Ezra and Nehemiah, and then it continues on to describe what happened after that point. So we read from that point up until Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 4. And that brings us just about to the time that is described in the very beginning of First Maccabees. And that is actually more so what we will start reading tonight in Chapter 5 of Book 12 of Antiquities of the Jews. So Chapter 4 takes us up to just before the history described in First Maccabees, and then Chapter 5 gets into that story. So last year, we didn't actually read Josephus' account of the Maccabean revolt and so on. We were reading the history of what took place between the days of Ezra and Nehemiah up into just prior to the Maccabean revolt. And we decided to go ahead and read that because this is valuable information which we were totally ignorant of until reading it last year. And what the Feast of Dedication highlights for us, or at least one of the things that it highlights for us, is the fact that there were many very important events which took place between the days of Ezra and Nehemiah and the days of Jesus and the apostles, which we need to become familiar with. Hanukkah is just like one of the most significant, obvious events. But there's a lot more. There's a lot more, and so it will be important for us not only to read what Josephus has to say about the Maccabean revolt and the dedication of the temple, but also the things after that. All of that took place in the time of the Greeks. But after that, there's still the Roman period being brought in. Ultimately, it will be important at some point, and we may not do all of this on the calls together, but we really encourage people to do this at some point, to read all of the writings of Josephus. It's just, there's a whole lot there. It's very important. It also shows us what Jews were thinking, or at least what some Jews were thinking, at the time of Jesus and the apostles. So, also before getting into chapter 5 here, I want to just give a brief mention concerning the time period described in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 4. One of the things that is in Chapter 4, paragraph 10, is it describes the death of Onias, who was high priest, from about the year 240 to 218 BC, and how the priesthood was left to his son Simon, who is actually Simon II, and he was high priest from 218 to 185 BC, and after he died, his son Onias, that is Onias III, he became high priest, and he was high priest from 185 BC to 175. So this is what, the time period that we are looking at is in the 170s BC. And in this next chapter that we're getting into, chapter 5 of Book 12 of Antiquities of the Jews, it's describing the death of this Onias and the next high priest, whose name is Jesus, who is actually also called Jason, and then also following him is another one who is also called Onias, but he's referred to also as Menelaus. Okay, so I would like to ask, before we get into reading here, and actually one thing else that I should mention, or two other things that I should mention. There are some links that you can find on the Branch Davidian SDA Facebook page and the Facebook group where you can read the writings of Josephus online. There's a link to earlyjewishwritings.com, and if you're not there and you don't want to go to Facebook, or you're not on Facebook, you can just go to www.earlyjewishwritings.com. And then if you scroll down on that page, you will see Josephus and the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 1, 2, 3, and so on until Book 20. If you click Book 12, that will take you to where you can read what we will be reading here. You'll notice that there is centered in the page chapters. So chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Then it should say chapter 4, but there's a typo on this web page where it says chapter 6. So after chapter 3, it goes to chapter 6. That's actually chapter 4. And then after that, you'll find chapter 5. And then following that again, the real chapter 6. So we are going to be reading from chapter 5. And it'll be good for us to continue with the same type of format that we had last year, where someone will read, and we'll have different people reading and so on. Someone can read a paragraph, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then we will discuss the contents of each paragraph. So someone will read it, we will discuss it. When we're done the discussion, we'll move on to the next paragraph. All right, so before we do that, are there any questions or comments concerning this whole discussion? All right, well, there does not seem to be. Who would like to volunteer to read our first paragraph? And actually, whoever does, please also read the Chapter 5 title. That gives a basic rundown of what Chapter 5 discusses.
I guess I can go ahead and read. If anyone wants to later on, just let us know. So Chapter 5. How upon the quarrels one against another about the high priesthood, Antiochus made an expedition against Jerusalem.
Sorry, I want to actually pause there. I think that there's a typo on the website. I'm looking in my, we have a translation that is in a hardcover book, and it says, how upon the quarrels of the Jews one against another about the high priesthood.
Yeah, I remember in editing the studies that I've been going through, there are a lot of typos in this online edition.
So that's unfortunate, but
okay.
We're glad to have that, of the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
How upon the quarrels of the Jews, one against another about the high priesthood, Antiochus made an expedition against Jerusalem, took the city and pillaged the temple, and distressed the Jews. Also, how many of the Jews forsook the laws of their country, and how the Samaritans followed the customs of the Greeks and named their temple at Mount Gerizim the temple of Jupiter Hellenius. Okay, paragraph 1. About this time, upon the death of Onias the high priest, they gave the high priesthood to Jesus his brother, for that son which Onias left, or Onias IV, was yet but an infant. And in its proper place, we will inform the reader of all the circumstances that befell this child. But this Jesus, who was the brother of Onias, was deprived of the high priesthood by the king, who was angry with him, and gave it to his younger brother, whose name also was Onias. For Simon had these 3 sons, to each of which the priesthood came, as we have already informed the reader. This Jesus changed his name to Jason, but Onias was called Menelaus. Now, as the former high priest, Jesus, raised a sedition against Menelaus, who was ordained after him, the multitude were divided between them both, and the sons of Tobias took the part of Menelaus, but the greater part of the people assisted Jason. And by that means Menelaus and the sons of Tobias were distressed and retired to Antiochus, and informed him that they were desirous to leave the laws of their country and the Jewish way of living according to them, and to follow the king's laws and the Grecian way of living. Wherefore they desired his permission to build them a gymnasium at Jerusalem. And when he had given them leave, they also hid the circumcision of their genitals, that even when they were naked they might appear to be Greeks. Accordingly, they left off all the customs that belonged to their own country and imitated the practices of the other nations.
Now, there are a couple of footnotes here. There's one after it says, as we have already informed the reader. So it says, for Simon had these 3 sons, to each of whom the priesthood came, as we have already informed the reader. There's a footnote. It's not shown on the website, unfortunately, but in the print edition, this is what it says. We have hitherto had but a few of those many citations where Josephus says that he had elsewhere formerly treated of many things of which yet his present books have not a syllable. In other words, they're saying, look, there's many places where Josephus says, we have formerly informed the readers about this, but in any of the writings of Josephus that we have, he doesn't refer to these things which he says that he's spoken of elsewhere. Our commentators have hitherto been able to give no tolerable account of these citations, which are far too numerous, and that usually in all his copies, both Greek and Latin, to be supposed later interpolations, which is almost all that has been hitherto said upon this occasion. In other words, they're saying, look, there's far too many times where Josephus says this, and it's in all the copies, both in Greek and Latin. It's just far too much to be interpolations. An interpolation is an insertion into a text by another author. And so it couldn't be that someone else is just inserting these things because, look, it's in all the manuscripts, and it's just so often that Josephus says this. And plus, why would someone interpolate something like that which has no actual content to it? So continuing with the footnote, what I have to say further is this, that we have but very few of these references before and very many in and after the history of Antiochus Epiphanes, and that Josephus's first book, the Hebrew or Chaldee, as well as the Greek History of the Jewish War, long since lost, began with that very history, so that the references are most probably made to that edition of the 7 books of the war. See several other examples besides those in the 2 sections before us in Antiquities, and then it gives several other references to Josephus saying this same sort of thing. Again, the sort of thing that he's saying that this footnote is commenting upon is saying something like, as we have already informed the reader. In other words, he's saying, we've already written on this particular aspect, but where he wrote of that particular aspect is lost. So that footnote is saying that he must have written this in the original version of History of the Jewish War that he wrote in Hebrew or Chaldean, and that is now lost to us, and so the references are probably to that, and the fact that it's lost is the reason why we no longer have those references. So that's the first footnote. The second one is dealing with the gymnasium. It says, this word, gymnasium, properly denotes a place where the exercises were performed naked, which, because it would naturally distinguish circumcised Jews from uncircumcised Gentiles, these Jewish apostates endeavored to appear uncircumcised by means of a, let's see if I can pronounce this, chirurgical operation. Chirurgical operation.
Mine just says surgical operation.
Okay, well that makes a lot more sense than chirurgical. Well, at least to me, because I'm not familiar with the word chirurgical. So either a surgical operation or whatever a chirurgical operation would be. Hinted at by St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 7:18, and described by Celsus, 7:25, as Dr. Hudson here informs us. So evidently there was some sort of operation whereby someone could reverse their circumcision, and he's pointing out that that's probably what these apostate Jews were doing. So anyways, that's the first paragraph. Are there any other comments on it? Would someone like to explain what they gather from this paragraph? How do you understand what it is saying? Well, we can't very well have a meeting with no participation. Is anyone there who would like to explain how they understand this first paragraph?
I'm here, and I don't have much of a voice. But what I see happening is it's like they kept it all in the family. You know, it's like when one dies, the next one in the family takes over, and they keep going on and on that way. And that these people that were Jews wanted to fit in and not be known as a Jew, so they undid their circumcision. I had no idea you could do that, but that was interesting.
Very interesting indeed. And thank you for commenting, even though I know your voice is strained and all of that. And don't feel like you have to, basically ruin your voice or anything like that. It's understood that you're not in the circumstance where you can talk a whole lot. Does anyone else have any comments on the first paragraph?
Well, it sounds like they just want to, abandon their faith and go with the Roman and Greek way, follow the Greek rulers, the Greek Roman laws, and just abandon theirs, even to the point of undoing it, physically.
Yeah, very interesting. And let me ask you guys, who specifically was it, according to this paragraph, who was, basically giving up Judaism, going after the Greek way of life, and desired the permission to have a gymnasium built in Jerusalem?
I'm going to take a stab at it. I don't have the book. I'm actually driving. Don't have it from me. But did you say that it was the son that got snubbed for the priesthood? That's just a stab.
I think it's the sons of Tobias, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the sons of Tobias and who else?
Did you say the Samaritans?
No. Not the Samaritans, no.
He said the sons of Tobias, also Menelaus, who was known as Onias.
Yeah.
There was a controversy between Jesus, who changed his name to Jason, and Onias, who was then called Menelaus. There is this war between the two of them, and Menelaus and the sons of Tobias were, it's put here, they were distressed. In other words, they were losing. And that's the way it appears to me, they were losing. And then they went to Antiochus and informed him that they wanted to leave the laws of their country and the Jewish way of living, etc.
Okay, so you have rival high priests, Jesus, who is called Jason, and Onias, who is called Menelaus. So it's between Jason and Menelaus. And according to this, Menelaus and the sons of Tobias were the ones who went to Antiochus and told him that they wanted to leave the laws of their country and the Jewish way of living and follow the Grecian way of living. And they wanted his permission, Antiochus' permission, to build a gymnasium at Jerusalem.
And according to the beginning of this chapter, it was the king, Antiochus, who deprived Jason, or Jesus, of the high priesthood to begin with and gave it to Onias. So that's why Onias went, or Menelaus, whichever one you want to call him, ended up going to Antiochus and saying, hey, this isn't working out. We're ready to have all of the Greek customs.
Now, there's something kind of interesting about this, because this history parallels the history recorded in 2nd Maccabees. But there are certain things that I want to read from 2nd Maccabees, and we can compare it to what we're finding here in Josephus and see what it says. So I'll start from 2nd Maccabees chapter 4, verse 7. When Seleucus died, and Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, succeeded to the kingdom, Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption, promising the king at an interview 360 talents of silver, and from another source of revenue 80 talents. In addition to this, he promised to pay 150 more if permission were given to establish by his authority a gymnasium and a body of youth for it, and to enroll the people of Jerusalem as citizens of Antioch. When the king assented and Jason came to office, he at once shifted his compatriots over to the Greek way of life. He set aside the existing royal concessions to the Jews, secured through John, the father of Eupolemus, who went on the mission to establish friendship and alliance with the Romans, and he destroyed the lawful ways of living and introduced new customs contrary to the law. He took delight in establishing a gymnasium right under the citadel, and he induced the noblest of the young men to wear the Greek hat. There was such an extreme Hellenization and increase in the adoption of foreign ways because of the surpassing wickedness of Jason, who was ungodly and no true high priest, that the priests were no longer intent upon their service at the altar. Despising the sanctuary and neglecting the sacrifices, they hurried to take part in the unlawful proceedings in the wrestling arena after the signal for the discus throwing, disdaining the honors prized by their ancestors and putting the highest value upon Greek forms of prestige. For this reason, heavy disaster overtook them, and those whose ways of living they admired and wished to imitate completely became their enemies and punished them. It is no light thing to show irreverence to the divine laws, a fact that later events will make clear. When the quadrennial games were being held at Tyre and the king was present, the vile Jason sent envoys, chosen as being Antiochian citizens from Jerusalem, to carry 300 silver drachmas for the sacrifice to Hercules. Those who carried the money, however, thought best not to use it for sacrifice, because that was inappropriate, but to expend it for another purpose. So this money was intended by the sender for the sacrifice to Hercules, but by the decision of its carriers, it was applied to the construction of triremes. That's my best go at that word. When Apollonius, son of Menestheus, was sent to Egypt for the coronation of Philometor as king, Antiochus learned that Philometor had become hostile to his government, and he took measures for his own security. Therefore, upon arriving at Joppa, he proceeded to Jerusalem. He was welcomed magnificently by Jason and the city, and ushered in with a blaze of torches and with shouts. Then he marched his army into Phoenicia. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon, to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of essential business. But he, when presented to the king, extolled him with an air of authority and secured the high priesthood for himself, outbidding Jason by 300 talents of silver. After receiving the king's orders, he returned, possessing no qualification for the high priesthood, but having the hot temper of a cruel tyrant and the rage of a savage wild beast. So Jason, who after supplanting his own brother was supplanted by another man, was driven as a fugitive into the land of Ammon. Although Menelaus continued to hold the office, he did not pay regularly any of the money promised to the king. When Sostratus, the captain of the citadel, kept requesting payment for the collection of the revenue was his responsibility, the two of them were summoned by the king on account of this issue. Menelaus left his own brother Lysimachus as deputy in the high priesthood, while Sostratus left Crates, the commander of the Cyprian troops. While such was the state of affairs, it happened that the people of Tarsus and of Malus revolted because their cities had been given as a present to Antiochus, the king's concubine. So the king went hurriedly to settle the trouble, leaving Andronicus, a man of high rank, to act as his deputy. But Menelaus, thinking he had obtained a suitable opportunity, stole some of the gold vessels of the temple and gave them to Andronicus. Other vessels, as it happened, he had sold to Tyre and the neighboring cities. When Onias became fully aware of these acts, he publicly exposed them, having first withdrawn to a place of sanctuary at Daphne near Antioch. Therefore Menelaus, taking Andronicus aside, urged him to kill Onias. Andronicus came to Onias, and resorting to treachery, offered him sworn pledges and gave him his right hand. He persuaded him, though still suspicious, to come out from the place of sanctuary. Then, with no regard for justice, he immediately put him out of the way. Okay, so I'm just seeing if there's anything else that says about Menelaus.
Makes it sound like Menelaus and Onias are two different people.
I have a comment.
Yes.
Question, actually. Can you tell me the reference again? I want to make a cross-reference in my books here.
Sure. This is reading from 2 Maccabees, chapter 4, verse 7 to, I just read to 34.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I find so interesting about this, and I'm looking ahead, there is more that it says here about Menelaus and Jason. But do you guys notice anything that is different between these two accounts?
According to 2 Maccabees, Jason is the one that wanted the gymnasiums built. According to Josephus, Menelaus or Onias was the one who wanted the gymnasiums built.
Yeah, very interesting, right? So this seems like quite the difference. Although in 2 Maccabees, they both Jason and Menelaus seem to be viewed somewhat negatively. But it's certainly in 2 Maccabees Jason who's bringing in all these different Greek ways. But in Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 5, it doesn't mention anything so far, at least, about Jason bringing in Greek ways. It's all focused on Menelaus. Menelaus and the sons of Tobias are the ones who are desiring permission to build a gymnasium from Antiochus, and they actually, went to Antiochus, and it seemed like things were good between Antiochus and them. And but in 2nd Maccabees, again, it's Jason who is the one who built the gymnasium, not Menelaus.
So the question is, if Josephus had these writings, why would he write his books differently if he had the Maccabees writings before that?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And I want to turn that back to you guys. What do you guys think?
Maybe it depends who's paying for the work to be done. They want their name to be important.
That's one answer. However, it seems like in this circumstance, for example, he's dealing with two people who were high priests basically 200 years before his time. And both of them are Jewish high priests, and he's writing this from Rome. So it's kind of hard to imagine any Roman, favoring one of these Jewish high priests over the other 200 years before. Are there any other possible explanations?
Well, I'm not sure about the connection with this, but when I continue to look at Josephus's paragraph here, there's a lot of Oniases being mentioned. I'll start at the beginning. About this time, upon the death of Onias the high priest, okay, so there's an Onias the high priest that was dead, they gave the high priesthood to Jesus, his brother. So there's Jesus who became Jason, brother to the high priest Onias who died. Now, in the 2nd Maccabees account, the Onias mentioned here that he was in opposition to, wasn't that his brother? He took, doesn't it say that he took the high priesthood from his brother? Obtained the high priesthood by corruption. It just says by corruption.
Well, it says Jason, the brother of Onias, obtained the high priesthood by corruption.
Yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that Onias was the priest at that time, does it?
Let's see here.
At the time when he took the priesthood by corruption. I'm not sure.
Well, it's talking about Onias in the previous context. And it's from what I remember, it is talking about Onias as the high priest. But I'm going to scroll up. Yes, it is in chapter 3, verse 33. Be grateful to the high priest Onias, and it continues to speak of that Onias as it continues on.
So in Josephus' account, he records that Onias, the brother of Jason, dies. And it's upon his death that they gave the high priesthood to Jason, or Jesus, his brother. And the reason is because Onias' son, also known as Onias IV, was just an infant. So Onias, the high priest, had a son named Onias, who was an infant, not old enough to take the high priesthood, so it was given to Jesus or Jason, according to Josephus. And then Josephus says, and in its proper place, we will inform the reader of all the circumstances that befell this child.
That being Onias the fourth, son of Onias the high priest, brother of Jesus, that is Jason.
Yes. Then he goes on, but this Jesus, who was the brother of Onias, was deprived of the high priesthood by the king, who was angry with him and gave it to his younger brother, whose name also was Onias. So there's 3 Oniases already.
Mm-hmm.
And according to this, Jason or Jesus had 2 brothers named Onias. Because look at that. Onias, the high priest, is dead. They gave the high priesthood to Jesus, his brother. But then the king takes the priesthood away from Jesus and gives it to his younger brother, whose name was Onias.
Hmm.
For Simon had these 3 sons, to each of which the priesthood came, as we have already informed the reader. So Simon, the high priest, had 3 sons, 2 of whom were named Onias.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Strangely, if that's correct.
Well, it would have been, that was a very common name at the time, because this Onias who we're talking about, the first one, who was the high priest before Jason, he was already Onias the third, son of Simon the second, son of Onias the second.
But the name 2 of your sons, the same name, seems strange.
Well, a comment here is that, in Iran, they call all their sons Muhammad. And I think out here in Rogersville, we have people that are Amish, and they call them all Samuel. So maybe it's not as uncommon as we think.
That's possible.
It's true, especially if they had more than one name, because this other Onias is also called Menelaus.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because in Josephus' account, Menelaus and Jason are brothers. In Maccabees, though, they don't appear to be brothers. Let's see. Okay, so when it talks about Menelaus becoming the high priest, it says, and let's see how it introduces Menelaus. Okay, it says, after a period of 3 years, this is in 2 Maccabees chapter 4, verse 23. After a period of 3 years, Jason sent Menelaus, the brother of the previously mentioned Simon. So there's a Simon that it mentioned previously, and this Menelaus is the brother of that Simon, to carry the money to the king and to complete the records of essential business, etc. Then it talked about how Menelaus ended up declaring himself high priest. Then in verse 26 it says, so Jason, who after supplanting his own brother was supplanted by another man, that is Menelaus.
Mm-hmm. Not his brother, according to this.
Right. Was driven as a fugitive into the land of Ammon. So here, Menelaus and Jason are not brothers, whereas in Josephus they are brothers. In 2 Maccabees, it is Jason who brings in all the Greek reforms, whereas in Josephus it is Menelaus who brings in all these Greek reforms. In 2 Maccabees, it is Jason who builds the gymnasium, whereas in Josephus, it's Menelaus who builds the gymnasium. So these seem like some significant differences.
Yeah, they're definitely not just a misunderstanding. It's contrary information.
So does anyone else, Rebecca's question is excellent. Why is it that Josephus, having these writings, and I don't think anyone really doubts that he had these writings. He makes use of them throughout his writings. So why would it be that Josephus would say things so differently, even though having these writings?
the thing that comes to my mind is that he must have thought he knew better. He must have thought he had better information.
And what would be a reason why he would think that he had better information?
I was going to say maybe he actually had some other information that he just didn't tell us about. And he felt like the weight of evidence was stronger for that than the other, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
That is certainly possible. There are books of the Maccabees that, because of Josephus' writings, we know at one time existed, but which we do not have today. And so it's possible that he had other writings which he considered to be more reliable and which he used in telling this story. One might say, well, wait a second, Second Maccabees must be the more reliable because it is an earlier account. But just because it's earlier than Josephus doesn't actually mean that it is the earlier account, because Josephus may be basing what he writes and even quoting something which came earlier than Second Maccabees. So this is all something to consider. I don't know exactly what the historical reality of this is, whether it was Jason or whether it was Menelaus. One might think, oh, well, when you read Second Maccabees, think about how it describes Jason, as being so wicked and it's so anti-Jason. And someone might say, oh, well, this obviously is not written from a strictly historical perspective because the author, or the authors rather, have an agenda. Yeah, they have an axe to grind against Jason. They have a clear agenda. Well, that doesn't mean that they're wrong, though. That's the thing. Just because they don't like Jason, maybe they don't like Jason because of all these things that he did. And someone might say, oh, well, Josephus is just watering it down. That's one way that people could understand it. So Josephus, he was writing this at the end of the 1st century of the Common Era, or the beginning of the 2nd century. Second Maccabees was written in about the year 124 BC. So that's a long time earlier. However, written in 124 BC is still a long ways away from the events that are being described, because we're talking about events now that took place in 175 or around there. So we're talking something that was 50 years earlier, and one might say, okay, well, that's really close, it's got to be right. But, hey, 50 years later, history can certainly be twisted. And I think within Adventist and Davidian history and branch history, we can have a fairly good understanding of that, of the fact that 50 years, and in 50 years a lot of confusion can happen. And people have different perspectives. Some people maybe liked Jason and didn't like Menelaus. And some maybe liked Menelaus and not Jason. And so different versions. But there are some points of commonality. One thing for sure is that at about this time, a gymnasium was built and that Greek customs were brought in. Whether it was through Jason or Menelaus, both have a general perception of both Jason and Menelaus that they were, at least to some extent in favor of Greek ways and so on. So anyways, perhaps we'll understand these things better as we continue on. But I think those are some important things to take note of within this first paragraph, that, hey, look, there are some differences between this account and what we read in 2 Maccabees. whether those differences are as a result of Josephus just changing the story, or whether he had information that is actually better than what is in 2nd Maccabees, or at least that he considered to be better. In any case, difference is actually valuable because it helps us to figure out what actually happened. I know some might say, oh, it makes it harder, but the thing is, if it was exactly the same, we would just have to take the word of both of them for it. The fact that there are differences shows us that most likely the common points between them are historically the case, because even though there are differences, and even though one places the blame, so to speak, on one versus another, it's still testifying to the fact that this thing happened. And so I think it's helpful and it's good to be aware and to take note of the fact that this is different from what we may already be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So any other comments, or are you guys ready to go on to paragraph 2?
I don't have any more comments.
Okay. The other option, also, rather than going on to paragraph 2, is that we could end the call here and continue on with paragraph 2 tomorrow. So that's certainly an option, especially if anyone else has any questions or comments on what we've been looking at. We could take a few minutes to address that and then bring the meeting to a close. Or if there's nothing else and everyone's fine with bringing the meeting to a close, maybe we should do that and continue on with paragraph 2 tomorrow.
Yeah, that might be a good idea. Now, there's no call during the day tomorrow. It's just 8 o'clock tomorrow night. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Sounds like a good idea, too. We'll have lots of meetings, and it'll all work out.
For sure. Okay, excellent. Would someone like to thank our Heavenly Family, and then we will close off?
I can. So, Heavenly Family, we want to thank you for, well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful Sabbath. I know we've all exited the Sabbath by now, but thank you. It's been a real blessing. And as we have entered now into the first day of the Feast of Dedication, we just want to ask that you would guide us to understand this history better. Help us to understand more of the significance for our time. And as we seek to understand the truth of things from even conflicting points in history, we thank you for the points that it does bring out, as Trent mentioned, how one thing that we can be pretty sure of is that they both state that the building of the gymnasium took place around that time, and this is when Hellenization started to take place. The Greek ways were really coming in. So we do thank you that even if the rest of it is a little bit unclear right now, that we know some things with relative certainty. And so as we continue to investigate this history as put forth by Josephus, please guide us in our discussion and help us to really be able to discern between truth and error, and that we can apply some of the critical thinking that we've been learning over the years in a very practical way to what we're going through here. And so we just thank you for an opportunity to review this history, and we invite you to teach us. We thank you, Father and Mother, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen.
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 Lila Tov.
Amen.
Lila Tov. Love you all.
Love you too.
Lila Tov. Love you guys. Good night.
Good night,
night.
everyone.